Welcome. We'll get started shortly. Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. There are no polling questions or attendance checks. Instead, you will demonstrate your knowledge by taking a brief multiple-choice quiz using the Earmark app. Visit earmark.app in your web browser. You can also download the mobile app by scanning the QR code on the screen. Log in, or if you're new, create your free account. Be sure to use a valid email address because that's where we'll send your course completion certificates. From the home screen, scroll down to find the course. You can also tap the magnifying glass icon to search for the course. Tap on the course artwork, then the Enroll button. On the Course tab, you'll find the recording and quiz questions. Complete the quiz to earn your CPE certificate. It takes us a few days to create the course on the app, so if you are attending this session live, please wait a few days. We'll email you a link to the course when it is ready. If you have questions or need help, email us at support@earmarkcpe.com. And now, on to the event.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zach from Earmark, and thanks for joining us today or watching this on demand. This is Closing the Empathy Gap, How Empathy Elevates Professional Skepticism and Audit Quality. I'm going to hand this over to your instructor for today, William Inglehop. William, please take this away.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Appreciate that. And welcome to this session called Closing the Empathy Gap. My name is Bill Inglehop, and for the last 35 or so years, I've been working in professional services, companies like KPMG, PwC, Accenture, and really working on how to continuously improve their business processes and really focusing for the last 9+ years on audits. So hopefully we'll be able to share some of that great information with you as we go through the presentation today. Here's the agenda for today's seminar. We're going to talk about this empathy gap and help explain what that is. We're going to talk about the two different types of empathy, which is the cognitive and emotional empathy. We'll give you a framework that you can use to help analyze the stakeholders that you deal with and use the empathy model in those conversations with them. We'll talk about how to design some empathy-based questions and really talk about how to take that question strategy up to the next level. We call it empathy-fueled skepticism. And lastly, we'll talk about some implementation strategies, and we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. Objectives for today. We're going to distinguish between the two different types of empathy that we talked about and why it's critical for audit effectiveness. We're going to apply this stakeholder framework to help understand why pressures, metrics, hidden concerns of audit committees, CFOs, or operational management affects how we deal with them. We'll design some audit questions that leverage this contextual understanding. And lastly, we'll talk about communicating difficult audit findings in ways that can maintain independence, but at the same time build trust and drive change. An important disclaimer, right? So my background, as you may know, I'm not an auditor, I'm not a CPA, so I'm not here to talk about anything new as relate to audit procedures. Right? We're not changing how you would do inquiries, confirmations, etc. What we want to change is how you actually do that kind of work through a better questioning strategy when you talk to your clients and your stakeholders. Why now? Right? Why is this such a critical thing to think about? Well, certainly pressure is on all areas of an audit function, be it an internal function, an external function, even within a finance function of an organization. So there's more complexity, more regulatory expectations. Secondly, is that there's certainly increased pressure on CFOs, controllers, audit committees to make sure that they're providing what they need to make sure the business meets all the compliance and regulatory environments, as well as maintain a good going concern. Often we say audit failures stem not from weak testing, but from a weak understanding of the stakeholder context. So we really want to focus in on how we can improve that. And then this gap that we talked about, right, which is really critical to understand because everyone on this call I know is a technical expert in audit, right? That's not what we're here trying to change. But we really want to help focus on is, are there ways to improve human understanding to help make us better auditors? So important thing to remember, we're not about being nicer. It's really how do we add some precision and skeptical air to our work and really become more effective in how we maintain and manage our audits. So I want to start with just a quick kind of, I'd call it a war story. A colleague and I were a number of years ago kind of sharing the, gee, you think it's awful kind of discussion over a couple of beers. And he was explaining to me a situation that even to the time he was relating it, even though it was several weeks old, it still kind of caused him to shake a little bit. He and his team had been working very diligently on a very complex transformation for a finance organization, a very large corporation, multiple entities, and so forth. And they were out talking with stakeholders and sharing some of the initial results and some of their recommendations with these stakeholders. And he had a meeting scheduled with a very senior individual in the finance organization, someone that had been there for probably 20 plus years, older gentleman, and they were supposed to talk with him on this particular day. Well, as it turned out, the team lead was not able to make it. They'd been held up and weren't able to make the meeting. And so on a kind of a fly decision, they decided, what the heck, we're just going to go in anyway. And they got through the first 2 or 3 pages of, as most consultants have, a good PowerPoint deck. And before they knew it, much like the picture shows here, this executive had stood up, threw the report that they had worked on very diligently into the garbage, and told them in no uncertain terms that they were to leave his office immediately. They did not want, he did not want anything more to do with these particular people, and please leave ASAP. And added in some extra exclamation points. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks because I think we've probably had some meetings like that before. So what happened, right? This team was in shock when they left. This colleague of mine, it is like one of those, it happened so fast he didn't know what hit him. Well, here's what basically failed them, is that they tried to come in with a really technically proficient presentation, but they didn't get the audience. They didn't read the room. And as it says here, the executive, it's like, it wasn't a solution. They were attacking his hard-won empire that he was dealing with. And it was a, we're doing it to you, not with you kind of approach that I think sunk this whole presentation. And at the end of the day, right, their big takeaway, they finally realized this, is that the executive, right, felt his attack was, or his career was under attack, and that they were threatening his legacy, they were threatening his reputation, and he didn't want anything to do with it. So question for today, how do we avoid this, right? How do we keep from falling in and ending up having our work thrown in the garbage? Well, the important thing to think about is this thing called the empathy gap. And it's important to understand when we talk empathy, right? I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what we mean by empathy and what it is and isn't. So we oftentimes say if we're being empathic or empathize with someone, we're agreeing with them. Maybe we have to kind of compromise our independence a little because we're trying to play their game or trying to get more into what they're doing. Maybe take the edge off some of the conclusions because we're sympathetic in some way or empathetic in some way to the people that we're talking about. What I really want to talk about, though, is using empathy to help us understand stakeholder context, those people that we're out talking to in the field, the executives, the people on the finance department and so forth, what's really going on and what's pressuring, what's moving them, right? Are there biases that are coming into play that we may need to know about that would help us? And also to really help ask deeper, and I would call them unanticipated questions, to really help sharpen our approach and make sure that we're really doing the digging where it needs to be done. Here's the problem with standard skepticism. And when we say standard skepticism, right, we all know auditors are supposed to be professional skeptics. They're not supposed to take anything at face value. They're supposed to validate all of the information that's given in front of them, make sure that it's checked and double checked and so forth. But what happens if we as auditors will sit and kind of handle this skepticism through almost what I would call them surface level questions? And they're almost in a way like softballs or layups for the people that you're asking. You know, give us some support. Walk me through this. What controls did you perform? I mean, those are all pretty perfunctory, basic audit 101 kinds of questions. And as we say, management probably has that answer well rehearsed. They've been asked before and they've been polished and they have everything they need in line for that particular answer. The problem you have with that is that you are getting compliance, not truth. And that's really what's important when we ask these questions. We really want to know what's going on, not just the PR version of the information that we're getting. So I mentioned two different types of empathy. Emotional empathy, which is feeling what someone else feels. So we say emotional empathy means the CFO is stressed and you're kind of anxious and stressed too. That's kind of an empathic response. Or if people get defensive around you, you've got to put your guard up and say, yeah, I'm going to be defensive too. Or if they're working excitedly about an issue or they've come to some new conclusion about something, you get excited about it. You get kind of swept up into all that too. The problem we have is that really is a danger when we're auditing. What we really want to understand is not the what someone feels, but why they're feeling the way they do and why they're acting the way they do. If the CFO is stressed, it helps to understand what's driving that stress. What kind of pressure is he under? When management gets defensive, we want to recognize what's the trigger. Why have they become defensive about a particular area or a particular issue that we're inquiring about in our audit? What's behind that, right? And then the third thing is that, you know, if they get wound up and excited about something, I want to find out the motivation, right? What's this sudden zeal that they may have shown for a particular area in the audit? Maybe it's a way they're interpreting a standard or some evidence you're looking at. What's triggering that, right? How did they get there? And that's really, once we get down to that why, that is really for us the most powerful piece of the package, right? That's really where we can understand and get down below the surface and dig to those questions that really need answers. One of the problems that we have is that emotional empathy clouds our judgment. Cognitive empathy sharpens it. For example, we're asking, drafting a question for our client, and we're thinking it's like, they seem really stressed about this, right? They seem stressed about hitting those targets. They're good people. They're under pressure. Maybe we can find a way to see the way through the way they see it. Maybe, right? If we take a cognitive approach under it, what we're saying is, I understand the pressure is there to hit targets. And that really is setting off alarm bells, because now I really need to find out, what are they doing, right? What is this pressure that they're under? And is it driving any behavior that I need to be aware of, or any activities that potentially affect the outcomes of my audit? Or the second example here, right? The idea around the going concern, right? The emotional approach might be, as you're drafting a question, you can see how scared the controller is about going, about a certain going concern disclosure. So one of those things we might say is, wow, this is really bad. I feel terrible for bringing this up. I'm not sure this is an area that we want to go down. They seem kind of sensitive about it. Well, if we took the cognitive approach, what it would tell us is that they're under some pressures here, right? That job, the company's survival, the employee livelihoods all have something relating to going concern. That's why I need to look at this more objectively and make sure that I'm evaluating it objectively and make sure that I'm communicating it as clearly as I can. When we use cognitive empathy, we want to say this makes you a better auditor. You're asking better questions, which is so critical because you're now understanding motivations, and it really gives you an idea that maybe we need to probe deeper if we truly understand that. If there's bias, we call them pressure points. Maybe there's some judgment that might be compromised. Maybe there's some areas, again, that might be red flags that we normally wouldn't uncover through more superficial questioning. You're communicating more effectively. You're able to frame findings in a context of their concerns, right? You're really thinking through how they need to hear this information and how I need to communicate it. And it really creates a better dialogue because now you're working together. You're on their wavelength, they're on yours, and we're connected. Your way to maintain relationships, people respect being understood, right? Even when you disagree with them, but they know you've heard them. And that's an important part of the connection here. And lastly, our goal here is that objectivity is maintained. We can understand, it doesn't necessarily mean we need to accept. So, a couple things to keep in mind here. First and foremost, we're not talking about compromising audit quality. That's, kind of one of those bottom lines, non-negotiables, right? This isn't a way to kind of fudge the edges. We're not telling people what they want to hear, right? Which is oftentimes a mistake. We try to get in nice with them. We try to be friendly. We want to tell them what they want to hear. That's not what this is about. Also, as hard as it is sometimes, it doesn't mean to avoid difficult conversations. We have an approach, we have a strategy to deal with difficult conversations, and we don't want to avoid them. And also, it's not about being nice, right? Being nice at the expense of rigor, right? They don't necessarily have to like us, and I'm sure for a lot of you, you know that feeling that you go into an audit and it's like you're not the most popular person in a room. But the point is you want the rigor of the audit, okay? What is it about, right? It's how to deliver those effective messages, those difficult messages. We want to build relationships that reveal truth, right? We want to make sure that as auditors, you're getting down to the nub, so to speak, of this issue. We want to maintain independence, but at the same time, make sure that there's trust in the relationship. And then lastly, we're going to get better audit evidence because we're managing our stakeholders better, we're communicating better, they're communicating better with us. So let's talk about the stakeholder framework, right? How would we apply this cognitive empathy model to some of the key people that we would deal with on a regular basis? And there's, in your audit universe, whether you work internally or externally, these are three pretty important groups of stakeholders. You've got your audit committee, you've got your CFO, and you've got your controller. And for each of these, what we want is to understand the primary pressure. We want to understand success metrics. Excuse me. And we want to understand any hidden concerns that may be present that we need to be aware of and that would affect in some way how we deal with them. So let's take a look at these three key stakeholders individually. So let's talk about our audit committee. What's their prime pressure, right? If you think about an audit committee, what are they responsible for, right? They have a regulatory, they have a fiduciary responsibility. There is certainly some concern about liability. If issues are not addressed properly or major concerns are brought forward. So what is one of their success areas? What are they focused on, right? Well, one is, and this is a pretty common thread across all three of these groups, they don't want surprises, right? They don't want something to suddenly pop up and there was no advance warning as to what was being said or something before they hear about it. Second thing they want, obviously, is a clean audit, right? They don't want to get into the weeds on this. They don't want any restatements. And as a subcommittee of the board, they also want to make sure that the board as a whole is confident in their findings and that they have done their job to oversee the audit. The hidden concern, are you telling us everything? What are we missing? We don't want surprises. We don't want to be caught off guard. What are we missing? So what do they don't need, right? What does your audit committee, what would things we not want to do with them? Well, one is overwhelming them with technical detail. Most audit committees, and there are, differences here and there, but they're probably not deep technical experts in audit. They may have some good financial background. They may even be CFOs in other organizations, but as a rule, they're not there to provide that kind of guidance. So they don't want to get overwhelmed with technical detail. The other thing is, when you come to this level, they don't want a problem that's not been presented along with a solution. They want a good, clear, crisp understanding of what the issue is and how it's being dealt with. And then again, as we talked about, no surprise. What they do need, right? So this is important, and there are obviously ways to communicate to the audit committee, but early warning is really critical. They want to know the risks, but they also need the context, right? Why is this a risk? Tell us, explain it, help us understand this. They want confidence that you're being thorough, right? They don't want to find out that something was missed or something was overlooked or we were rushed and didn't finish the analysis, whatever kind of thing. They want to know that you've been thorough. And again, because they're not technical experts, right, we need to speak to them in plain language. We want to make sure that they're clear on everything that we're saying and they understand exactly what the approach is. So what would be the communication strategy? Well, here's one example. If we just came in and flat out were doing our report and said, yeah, we've identified some weaknesses in your recognition controls, and we kind of leave it at that, that's dropping something we don't want to drop. What we do want to say is we found a gap. Here's what the risk is, and here's what management is doing about it. And here, as auditors, here's what's happening for us to be comfortable with this, and whether or not it has impact or not on our audit. And that's a solid statement that they can get behind. Now, they may ask more questions about it. They may ask for some clarifications, but you've started the discussion in the right direction. And remember the empathy play, right? Our goal is cognitive empathy. And when we mean cognitive empathy, we want to understand, where are they coming from, right? What is the motivator what is the motivator for them on the audit committee? And this is where we say they have a fiduciary burden. We understand that. And we want to make sure that they're getting sufficient information to fulfill their oversight role. And again, I keep saying it over and over, no surprises. Let's talk about our friendly CFO. Right? What are some of the pressures on our CFO? Well, they got to deliver results. That's why they're there, right? They need to hit the targets, and they need to keep that board happy. Their prime client or the audit committee, CFO, there's a direct relationship there. They need to make sure that they're all in the loops here. And overall, at the end of the day, right, he's one of the key people that's going to keep that business running. So from an audit side, right, what we're working on is what are some of the metrics that are driving our CFO? Financial performance is certainly critical. That's what they're gauged on. They probably have compensation based on that, right? Clean audit, right? They don't want problems with the audit, right? That's a huge issue for them. Manageable surprises. Hopefully they're announced early rather than later. And then the key thing, obviously, is because of that relationship, they want to be credible with the board, right? They don't want the rug pulled out from them by the auditors. And as we say here, right, what's the hidden concern, right? Are you going to make me look bad? Is this going to derail our strategy? Am I going to be able to make our goals? And then if you're a publicly traded company, the big elephant in the room is, what are the shareholders going to think about this, right? So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of hidden concerns that are riding on that CFO's shoulders. What they don't need. And this first one is really, really a key one. And I hear this a lot from clients, that the auditors don't get the business. They have people, and particularly the nature of the business, oftentimes people are rotated in and out. They haven't worked on an audit long enough, but having that person or persons plural in the business that knows the business and has been there and can kind of talk the talk of the business is so critical. And they will sniff out somebody that's a newbie like in a nanosecond. And I've seen it happen a number of times where people have been summarily dismissed because they just didn't get what the business was about. Theoretical perfection over practical reality. The CFOs are not theoreticians. That's not their job. They're there to run a business. And so regaling them or going on and on about this and that part of the regulation and kind of thing, mildly interesting, but at the end of the day, it's like, okay, so what do I have to do? What does it mean for me? And then obviously we talked about any of the gotchas, which we never want with any of our clients, let alone a CFO. And then this last idea around surprises in front of the audit committee, right? Again, we talked about that earlier with the audit committee. They don't want their surprises. We certainly don't want the CFO to be surprised. They need to be dialed into everything that the auditors are going to talk about. So what do they need, right? Again, people that get the business, right? They've been there, done it. They've got the t-shirt, so to speak, right? They know the business. Early discussion of potential issues. And this is really interesting because it's sometimes very problematic because oftentimes issues get pushed down the path and they don't get escalated to a point where they can be dealt with. And many times a lot of these issues that could be dealt with early in the audit end up being addressed late in the audit, and they become surprises. And that's something that we try not to do, right? So having a good path for escalation of issues, getting them resolved quickly, and the early phases of the audit goes a long way. They want collaborative problem solving. If there's issues or concerns, they want somebody to work with them to come to a mutually agreeable solution. And then lastly, they're CFOs, right? They are a C-level executive, and they certainly want to be recognized as someone who earned that title. So what's the plan, right? How do we talk to our CFOs? Well, first and foremost, right, we want to make this we're not police people, right? We're there to audit, right? And so we say it doesn't comply with the standards. That's a little harsh. But instead, what we can say is, I get what's going on here. I understand the complexity of this particular issue. Here's where what we see in the standard and what's happening requires something different. Let's walk through some options. Let's do some problem solving on how we can get to a mutually agreeable solution. The empathy play, which is so critical here. We got to acknowledge those business pressures. And we oftentimes have no clue half the pressures that the CFOs are under, but the more we can understand that, the better. We want to frame the audit as a partnership, not policing, and always give them the ability to maintain that credibility. Think problem solving and think respect for their expertise. And if we keep that in the back of my mind or your mind, you'll be off on a good start. Let's talk about the third one that's in our little stakeholder group, the controller. So think about the controllers that you either work with or you've worked with as clients. They're often people that are kind of in the middle, right? And because of all of the various cost-cutting initiatives and so forth that a lot of corporations and businesses are going under, they're often undersourced. And as more regulatory requirements are getting dropped in their lap, they're often overwhelmed and under-resourced. And that's particularly when they're taking on certain functions of the auditors, right? Work by others is often falling under the controller's lap, and they are responsible for not only their own work, but also managing either an internal audit function or another group that's providing work for external auditors. So they've got a lot going on. What are their success metrics, right? They're looking for a clean audit. They want to keep the boss happy, right? That's important. They want their processes that they're responsible for, and they're really down at that level, right, where they're overseeing a lot of critical processes in the business. They want to make sure they're worked, and they want to make sure that they keep their team intact. They don't want to overwork their team. The hidden concern, right? Do you really get how hard this is? And what if something goes wrong? Am I going to be the fall guy or fall girl? Right? They don't want to be caught in the middle of that conversation. And key thing, right? We've got to be careful about how we pile on, or if we do, are we piling on, ? More work without constraints. We want to make sure that if we do criticize, we have to understand the reality, right? And we don't want, and certainly this individual does not want to be thrown under the bus. We don't want to have a conversation with the CFO and say, well, if it wasn't for that controller, this wouldn't have been a problem. Don't do that. And also anything that would be viewed unrealistic. And again, that's probably in part a negotiation, because many times it can be done. It just has to be helped and discussed and prioritized. But they will probably push back on most things that you drop in their lap as saying, can't do it, don't have the time, don't have the bandwidth. So that's part of that discussion. So what do they need, right? That resource constraint. You know you're dealing with a resource constrained organization. Even if they don't say it, they're probably constrained because they got a lot going on. Not only are they managing you as an external auditor or working with your internal audit team, but they also have to take care of managing the day-to-day finances, monthly close, so forth, preparing all of the various statements and documents that are required. So there's a lot going on. They want to be practical, just like our CFO, but this person is even more practical because they're in a bind. They're in a hurry. They want to get stuff done. They want to get items off their plate. So they want something that's practical. And again, partnership, not judgment. And at the end of the day, making sure that, as we said earlier, we're not throwing this person under the bus. We're giving them the cover and protection to make sure that they can get their work done. So what's the strategy here? One of those things we don't want to say is, you should have caught this. Shame on you, bad you, whatever. I mean, we don't even want to imply that, right? On the other hand, we could say, you're a little stretched. I get that. I can see that your team is really struggling here. Let's work on this together, right? How can we get this without adding more to your plate, right? That's a good, positive conversation. Treat them as an ally, not an adversary. And I know, again, that's often difficult in audits, particularly as external auditors, because they're often viewed as something that we want to get in and get out as quickly as possible, right? But again, you got to treat them as partners and make sure that they have wins, right? Areas where they can focus on to show that they're being cooperative, that they're helping, they're getting stuff done, and that gets communicated up above. The relationship with your controller is critical, right? And as we say, they know where all the bodies are buried. And if you lose that, you got a lot of problems, and you're going to have to do a lot of extra work to get stuff done. You don't want to lose their trust at the end of the day, because they really have that window into what's going on with the audit. And if they get that you get them, right, that trust element is increased, and they will help you understand their world, and you will have a much more productive audit as a result. So in summary, here's our framework. And if we were going to do this, this is something you could even do before you meet with these people, right? Just walk through what some of these areas are, right? Making sure you know what the primary pressure is. And, it's one of those questions that you hear people ask a lot, but here to have some meaning, right? What's keeping you up at night, right? What's the stuff where at 3 o'clock in the morning they wake up with the sweats, right? What's going on, right? Help us understand what's going on in your world. Success metrics, right? What's driving them, right? Because if you think about it, the old adage, what gets measured gets managed. That's certainly true in a lot of these areas. And if we understand what those are, we know what they're doing and also things that they potentially are not doing. And then also hidden concerns. Are there things that they wouldn't say directly, but would have some bearing on the audit? So what the pressure is, needs, and concerns, right? With their audit committee, the liabilities are the big pressures, the needs, no surprises, and what's concerned, audit committee is going to say, are we missing anything? What don't we know that we need to? Your CFO got the pressure, deliver the results. Got the partnership, you want early warnings, and will this hurt us? And then lastly, our controller, they're the people that are caught in the middle. They want recognition, they need help them get that, right? And also just keep thinking, right? They even if they don't say it, they're going to be motivated by this is really hard and you're asking a lot of me. So if we pull down some common threads, no surprises, right? We talked about that. It really permeates all three of our key stakeholders. They want early communication and they want often. I would add often to that. They want understanding of their context. They just don't want solutions. They want solutions, not problems. And lastly, understand the world that they're in. What are their constraints? What are those things that are really holding them back that would allow them to get the work done that they want to? So the framework in action, right? How would we put this into play if we were going out and building some audit questions, whether we're out to interview internal audit stakeholders, whether we're doing external interviews? How would we do this? So just some simple questions that we could ask before we start framing out these questions. I know auditors will always go out with a predefined list of questions that they want to get after, and I would add some of these to that list, right? What pressures is this person under? Can we visualize ahead of time what's going on there, or can we learn from others what kind of pressures they're under? Is the conversation in the area that we're going to talk about, does it have any bearing on their success metrics, right? Are there areas that might, again, be kind of triggers that would cause some issues that we have to be attentive to? Are there hidden concerns, things that might be under the surface that we're not aware of, but could elevate through some good questioning? And lastly, making sure that we can acknowledge their reality, but we want to maintain the quality, right? We're not there. We're not trying to go down the path with them. We're not trying to necessarily agree with them, but we want to make sure that we acknowledge where they're at and what they're coming from. So maintaining independence, right? This is a mistake that many auditors can make. Keeping emotional distance, right? You don't need to be there, right? Not getting too friendly, treating clients as adversaries, avoiding understanding their perspective. Those are wall builders, not boundary builders. And our goal here really is to make sure that we are applying this, again, this professional skepticism, but making sure that we require that understanding, the pressures, the motivations, and the biases. And you can't effectively challenge what you don't understand. You end up going down that superficial route, that preordained question and performative answer route is what you'll end up with. So how do we design empathy-based audit questions, right? We want to use this idea called empathy fueled, right? So before asking the what the control is, we want the why, all right? What's under pressure here, right? So the basic question, and I'm sure you've asked this hundreds of times of your clients, walk me through your revenue recognition steps, or walk me through the inventory control process. You can probably recite those in your sleep. If we add the empathy component to it, it's like, wait a minute, there's some stuff going on here. They've had a tough quarter, right? How has that changed this particular area that we're going to be looking at, right? Are there some potential risks that we need to uncover here that by knowing that might change the strategy for our questions? So how do you ensure the judgment wasn't influenced by the targets, right? What's going on here? Help me feel comfortable about what you're doing. And again, as we say down here, most auditors know what different stakeholders want, but few understand the why. And that's really what we're trying to get after. The why before the what. So 3 ways that we can really bring this to a close here. 1, what's this empathy-fueled skepticism? We want to get the bias out before it manifests. We want to understand what those pressure points are and really steer us where we can look. For example, CFO, compensation, he's got EBITDA. Let's see, are we really comfortable with those estimates? Because there's some big bucks that are lying on how those numbers come out. Or a controller is new and overwhelmed. Are they cutting corners? Are they trying to shortcut some things because they just don't have the time to do things correctly? And then lastly, right, maybe there's some issues around some loans or some debt obligations, right? Are there judgments that are affecting how those things are being reported to their creditors or to the shareholders? It's really important to understand that. Empathy creates the mental map of where bias might hide. So that's really important. And, the important thing to remember too, and it's like, this isn't, a lot of these things that we're talking about isn't necessarily trying to like uncover fraud, but just making sure that the people that we're talking to are clear and direct in what they're doing, and we understand what those relationships are. Second thing that we talk about is we want to be revealing information, not just verifying it. We can look through a lot of documents and look and see, yep, that's what it says, that's what it says, that's what it says. But the standard skepticism, as we say, verifies it. Empathetic skepticism reveals what isn't. For example, you have an allowance methodology, right? What is it, right? That's a simple question. They could probably answer that in a couple sentences. On the other hand, if we say, wow, yeah, I've noticed lately that there's been a lot of pressure to show growth here, right? How has that challenged your own assumptions on collecting debts or outstanding receivables, right? If you can't effectively challenge what you don't understand, you can't effectively challenge what you don't understand. Here's the third component. It builds trust that unlocks information. When people get that you understand them, they will probably be more open and more forthcoming. Again, not necessarily agreeing, but we're understanding, right? And not because they feel comfortable being deceptive, but they feel safe because they get what you're talking about. You get them. I wasn't entirely sure about this judgment is something they'll say only if they trust the auditor, which again opens up a line of questioning and some query that becomes a much deeper conversation than if they just said, here's my judgment. So the questioning mind, informed by context, supported by evidence, and sharpened by awareness of pressure-driven bias is what we're after. So implementation strategies, right? How do we get this into our everyday? Well, think about putting some of these context prompts, right? Those pressure biases like we showed on the chart earlier, put them in the planning memos. Are there areas that we need that are triggering some areas that we want to investigate further? We could use that stakeholder framework in our planning meetings or our kickoff meetings with our audit teams, helping people understand what some of these key stakeholders, what some of the pressures are, some of the biases that may be present and that we need to be alert for when we audit. This idea of a pressure assessment, right? How high are the screws on these particular people, right? Where are they feeling the heat? And again, is that something we as auditors need to be familiar with? Coach the teams, right? If you're working in a position that you can direct as a manager or senior manager or audit executive, help coach the teams on question redesign. Make sure that they're going beyond just some of these superficial kind of softball questions and that there's really some meat behind the questions. And as we debrief each of the audit areas, we want to make sure that we understand and highlight any that have been identified, or maybe some that we've missed, right? There may be some issues or some concerns that people identified after the fact, but you say maybe that triggers some discussion and we may want to go back and look at them further. So some key takeaways. Understanding does not necessarily equal agreement, right? We can understand where they're coming from. We can use this cognitive empathy, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean an agreement, and it doesn't have to poison or dilute our skepticism. Cognitive empathy increases skepticism. That's really the key thing here. Once we understand that context that they're coming from, those pressures, we're in a much better position. It reveals where risk actually lives. It's oftentimes what's unspoken in these interviews, not what's spoken, where you start getting between the lines, right? Better questioning strategy is going to drive better evidence. And then lastly, empathy is a strategic audit capability, right? We oftentimes look at things, we call them soft skills, but this should be a critical tool that you have in your audit toolbox. Lastly, let me leave you with this thought. Change might not be fast. It isn't always easy, but with time and effort, almost any habit can be reshaped. And that's really what we need here. It's to practice, put this in motion, right? Little by little, you'll get better at it, and you'll see some results as you go through your audits. And with that, thank you. I appreciate your time and attention today. I am with Auditology. And if you want more information about Auditology, the links are down at the bottom. I would be happy to connect with anyone if they want to connect via LinkedIn. It's also my email address down there. Also, I've written a book. It's called Managing the Hell Out of Your Audit. And it's a real practical how-to guide to improve the quality, the efficiency, reduce the defects and so forth for your audit. And I would encourage you, if you want some additional reading on it, there's a QR code that'll take you to Amazon. And then lastly, take a look at the book itself on empathy. As a really good deep dive on a lot of the topics that we talked about there. A gentleman by the name of Daniel Murray. I would certainly, if you're interested, encourage you to take a look at that as well. And last and not least, I would love some feedback. Please go use the QR code. It'll ask you some quick questions for some feedback. I would appreciate that. And if you complete the survey, there's a prize with purchase. We'll send you a short little additional handout tool that goes well with this workshop. So hopefully you'll find that valuable. And Zach, with that, I'll open it up for you. If there's questions in the chat, I'll be happy to answer some questions.
I don't see any questions right now. So thank you so much, Bill. And for anyone who is attending this live, here's a quick reminder on how you can earn CPE credit for today's webinar.
Today's event has ended. To earn CPE, go to earmark.app or scan the QR code on the screen. Then log in or create your free account. Search for the course by tapping on the magnifying glass icon on the home screen and then entering the name of this event. It takes a few days to make the course, so if you're attending this event live, keep an eye out for an email letting you know when the course is available. Pass the quiz to earn your CPE, then tap the button to email yourself a certificate. Stay tuned for more events from Earmark. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.